Hello, epistemologists. So today we're starting our unit. It's a very short one-week unit on standpoint theory. And standpoint theory, sometimes known as feminist standpoint theory, sometimes thought of as a subset of feminist philosophy of science, is actually maybe better called standpoint theories because there are many different views about what a standpoint is, who has one, what it's for, how you get it, and all that good stuff. But the focus of standpoint theory, in my opinion, is the idea that someone from a particular marginalized perspective, for example, someone who's a woman in a space that tends to be a masculine space, might have insights or knowledge or epistemic resources available that are not had by the person in a position of power. So the idea is that someone who has experienced oppression or who is oppressed might have specialized and distinctive knowledge that they can bring to bear on important questions. And now I'll be analyzing this concept a little bit further, but just to open up, I wanted to read you a passage from Virginia Woolf. And this is specifically from Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which is actually a collection of 2 essays and 2 lectures that she gave once upon a time. So this quote is from the second of her lectures, where she has gone to the British Museum to try to figure out what women are and what women's problems are. And she goes into the British Museum and she looks them up in the British Museum library. Here we go, quote, "Why are women, judging from this catalog, so much more interesting to men than men are to women? A very curious fact it seemed, and my mind wandered to picture the lives of men who spend their time in writing books about women, whether they were old or young, married or unmarried, red-nosed or hump-backed. Anyhow, it was flattering, vaguely, to feel oneself the object of such attention, provided that it was not entirely bestowed by the crippled and the infirm. So I pondered until all such frivolous thoughts were ended by an avalanche of books sliding down onto the desk in front of me. Now the trouble began. The student who has been trained in research at Oxbridge has no doubt some method of shepherding his question past all distractions till it runs into his answer as a sheep runs into its pen. The student by my side, for instance, who was copying assiduously from a scientific manual was, I felt sure, extracting pure nuggets of the essential ore every 10 minutes or so. His little grunts of satisfaction indicated so much. But if, unfortunately, one has no training in a university, the question, far from being shepherded to its pen, flies like a frightened flock, hither and thither, helter-skelter, pursued by a whole pack of hounds. Professors, schoolmasters, sociologists, clergymen, novelists, essayists, journalists, men who had no qualification save that they were not women, chased my simple and single question, why are some women poor? Until it became 50 questions, until the 50 questions leapt frantically into midstream and were carried away." So basically, Virginia Woolf wants to just study the very, very straightforward sociological question, why are women poor? And the things that she finds in the library are contradictory and range all over the place, and they're all written by men. And so she can't seem to find her answer in the library. And in the course of trying to find her answer in the library, she notes kind of what different men have thought about women over the years. And she writes, quote, "Are they capable of education or incapable? Napoleon thought them incapable. Dr. Johnson thought the opposite. Have they souls or have they not souls? Some savages say they have none. Others, on the contrary, maintain that women are half divine and worship them on that account. Some sages hold that they are shallower in the brain, others that they are deeper in the consciousness. Goethe honored them. Mussolini despises them. Wherever one looked, men thought about women and thought differently." She continues, "It was impossible to make head or tail of it all, I decided, glancing with envy at the reader next door who was making the neatest abstracts, headed often with an A or a B or a C, while my own notebook rioted with the wildest scribble of contradictory jottings. It was distressing, it was bewildering, it was humiliating. Truth had run through my fingers. Every drop had escaped." So this experience that Virginia Woolf is having, and which she didn't have the tools to put a name to, is the kind of thing that standpoint theorists are interested in capturing. Virginia Woolf is experiencing a situation where a lot of people seem to be very interested in studying her and her experiences, but they all seem to completely miss the mark. She finds herself not reflected in the descriptions that men are giving of her, and she can't find the answer to the question that she's actually interested in, which you might think would be helpful to society to know the answer to, namely the question, why are women poor? And she wants to know the answer to this question because she's actually been asked to talk about women and fiction. And rather than talk about women in fiction, she wants to talk about women writing fiction. And so in order to talk about women writing fiction, she'd like to talk about what it takes to write fiction, which is to have some money. And then it turns out, well, why do women not write fiction? Well, because they're poor. But why are they poor? She doesn't come up with an answer in the library, unfortunately, which is where you think such an answer would be found. Although she lived in different times. Maybe now the answer is available in your local library. Standpoint theory has, in its kind of deepest applications, the view that any scientific enterprise is going to be normative all the way down. That is to say, anytime that you're doing an inquiry, your inquiry will be somewhat guided by the questions that the inquirers are interested in, and importantly, the values that those inquirers have. And not all of those values will always be scientific values. So if we look at Woolf's fascination with the endless amount of volumes written about the woman question in her time period and before her time period, it's clear that lots of men were interested in asking about women and the condition of women and what women are and how women are and how they think and how they're composed and how we should behave toward them as men, right? But what it seems like she didn't find is an actual kind of elimination of all of the possibilities and an inclusion of the perspective of women themselves, which you might think is maybe kind of important to the question of what women are and how women think and what women do and how we should behave toward them, for example. So Woolf's case is a particularly egregious case of an epistemic failure by maybe otherwise virtuous inquiring minds, right? So people like Goethe, who she names, aren't, epistemically incorrect people. Dr. Johnson, for all that he sounds like, seems like a smart enough sounding guy, right? He's a doctor. She quotes Samuel Butler and poets like Pope, and they all have 1,000,001 opinions, but it seems like they're all missing something crucial. And what's interesting is it seems like they're all in conversation with each other. And so, the typical scientific story is the more people that you get talking about an issue and the more attention you give to that issue over time, kind of science will find a way to answer the relevant question. But Woolf's case shows us an example of how there's a way to frame the question that can already get you in trouble and already get you started off on the wrong path and not actually inclined to answer the question in the right way at all. And there's a way also of missing out on the epistemic insights of other people in your community that could be helpful toward your inquiry. Now, in the specific instance of gender and studying gender, it's especially obvious to us now in 2020 that it's very difficult to study gender if you never consult the people who have or identify with the gender that you are studying. It's just not going to go well for you. But maybe you think to yourself, well, what about other scientific enterprises? Like if you're trying to study photons, does it matter that your scientists be from a variety of communities, some of who experience a lot of privilege and some of who experience a lot of oppression? Not clear that you do. But standpoint epistemology says, hold on a second. So one thing that unites standpoint theories as a whole is the idea that there are social features of people or groups of people from which or at which distinctive knowledge can be produced or acquired. That is to say, differences between people can be the source of epistemic resources. Depending on what theory you have, what epistemic standpoint theory you have, this may be due to or explained by epistemically privileged experiences, social locations, or even access to feminist discourse. In the case of Virginia Woolf, you might think if she had access to feminist discourse that was well developed between a number of women, she might have had the resources and the tools to answer her question, why are women poor, which she doesn't have. So it might be the case, depending on which standpoint theory you're operating on, that Woolf, at least in the middle of her essay, hasn't yet developed a standpoint. So according to some standpoint theories, a standpoint is something that you develop. It's not something that you just have automatically as a matter of existing as a marginalized person. You have to work at it. And definitely, according to Nancy Hartsock, whatever a standpoint is, it is an achievement. So the distinctive knowledge that you could come to have because of your epistemically privileged experiences or social location or your access to feminist discourse, you have to achieve that standpoint. So you might be born a woman, or you might be born a Black woman, or you might be born an Asian man, or you might be born non-binary, but you won't necessarily have access to the standpoint that accrues to someone who has your experience and your social location unless you've done some epistemic work. But because you're in a marginalized position, the theory says, you have epistemic resources, and in a sense, you have an epistemic advantage that you wouldn't otherwise have were you not a member of that marginalized group or that marginalized community, which comes as a surprise. So what is the reason why people started thinking this way? And, you know, before we talk about pros and cons with the theory, we really want to get a sense of like why we should buy into this theory in the first place. It certainly seems to have a lot of commitments already. So one of the origins of standpoint theory was originally the theory of Marxism. It's not the only origin, but it was one of the main sources. So in Marxist discourse, you have a privileged social class, which is the class that owns the means of production, right? And it's materially defined. So there are the people who have the means of production, and there are the people who don't have the means of production. So you've got the bourgeoisie and you've got the proletariat. The proletariat are the people who don't own the means of production. So according to materialists, like Marxist materialists, material oppression is the locus of a potential gold mine of distinctive knowledge. The proletariat, for example, might know things that the bourgeoisie could not easily come to know because of their social situation, which is constituted by material relations. Think of, for example, the TV show Downton Abbey. In this TV series, the servants of a large household live beside, but in many ways separate from, the rich inhabitants of the house. Their shared and unshared dramas often highlight the ways in which the servants are privy to knowledge that the bourgeois masters are ignorant of, partly because of their very social and material circumstances. So if you're a butler in Downton Abbey, you often have access to the privileged world, but also access to the marginalized world of the basement and the kitchen. So the butler, in a sense, knows everything that's happening in the house. And so does the housekeeper. They have a privileged access to, in a literal sense, the stuff that's happening. But in another sense, their sort of marginalized position relative to the wealthy owners of the household also gives them some other sources of knowledge, and sometimes requires them to know things that their masters or their employers do not have to know. For example, you know, there's all sorts of skills and abilities that they have that the owners of the household have no skill set in. If all of the servants were one day to disappear from Downton Abbey, there's no way that they'd be able to run the place, the owners of the place, because they just don't, like, how often have they had to light a fire or wash their own clothes or make their own food or set the dinner table or polish the silver or all of these other things that are done by the people that run the household, but that do not own the household. So there's practical knowledge that they have, there's situational knowledge that they have, and there is additionally knowledge that they have about both the world and the concepts that accrue to the privileged group. They know things about the proper and improper way to behave if you're a member of high society, because they've got to, because they have to serve that part of society. But they also know a lot of things about how to be and behave and follow the social norms of a different part of society. So in a sense, the butler and the maid have an enormous wealth of knowledge and In fact, according to this theory, if it's right, epistemic privilege that accrues to them because of their marginalized position. So were you to extend this kind of Marxist analysis to other realms of the social practice of knowledge, you would find that if it was only ever people in materially privileged positions that created and investigated knowledge and conducted inquiry, you'd be missing a lot of crucial information. Basically, you'd be doing bad science because the people who are in materially privileged positions are actually epistemically worse off. There's all sorts of stuff that they don't know. They don't have practical knowledge. They don't have situational knowledge. They don't know how the world works outside of their own tiny bubble, all of this other stuff. So standpoint theorists in this early period were very excited by the possibility of saying, hey, here's a reason that everybody has to care about feminist issues and anti-racist issues. It's not just that like we care because we care about women and because we care about marginalized people from different racial and social groups and accessibility and all that stuff. It's not just because you should be nice to us that you should pay attention to feminist theory. It's also because you are missing out. You're not doing good science. You're not doing good inquiry. You're going to produce poorer knowledge if you don't take into account the distinctive perspective of people from these privileged standpoints. So that first Marxist analysis later got, and at the time also got responses from various feminist theorists and sometimes not feminist theorists from philosophy of science, critiquing and modifying the views. So some people like Hartsock are materialists, and people like Hartsock think that standpoints are achievements, so you've got to work at them. Just because you're a member of the proletariat doesn't mean you automatically possess knowledge that other people don't. You have to sort of get in a political struggle and do empirical inquiry and like communicate with other people in your community, and that class solidarity builds knowledge, and the building of the knowledge creates a standpoint that you can then inhabit and that you can then take with you into inquiry. But according to other theorists, it might be possible for you to have a standpoint purely because of your experiential situation or your social location. Sometimes people speak this way about the experience of women, the kind of gender oppression as it accrues to different people is quite distinctive, and there might be some things that you know about society that you don't need anybody to tell you just because you've had an embodied experience in this particular way. Now, I personally don't have strong opinions about which standpoint theory is the correct theory, but I do think it's helpful to make use of Hartsock's theory on which standpoint is an achievement, because it will give us some of the benefits of the view without requiring us to explain by what mechanism everybody who is marginalized just automatically gets some epistemic privilege, when often it seems to us to be the case that if you're like materially marginalized or if you're oppressed by society, it can be harder for you actually to form community and to accrue knowledge. And so it might be suspicious if you think that it's just automatic that the standpoint accrues to you. So let's for now think of standpoints as achievements and things that you create, both because of your solidarity with other people from your group and your political struggle, and because of your actual active empirical inquiry into the world and your own experience. We can see in A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf's own epistemic struggle and her own inquiry and her own seeking solidarity with her friends to talk about this issue of women and fiction and why more women are not authors of fiction. And she comes to realize that the reasons why women don't write fiction are obscure to men, who have a tendency to attribute this lack of fiction writing to something about women's character, when with Virginia Woolf, who has better information than they do, comes to understand and believe and know that it's because of women's material circumstance that they don't produce more fiction, not because they're lacking some character trait. Now, one reason standpoint theory has had such a foothold in academia since the 70s and 80s, and it just sort of become stronger and then faded and is sort of still around. One reason is that it highlights how the normative pervades science. The direction, conceptual frame, research methods, and content of science, standpoint theorists point out. See, for example, our reading with Harding is ordinarily determined by values and interests of the inquirers. What then, the standpoint theorist asks, if the values and interests science is pervaded with are the values of the dominant and oppressive group, rather than values shared by the oppressed or underprivileged groups, or the values held uniquely by the oppressed? So the standpoint theorist, when they realize if it's true, so ask yourself, do you think that all of scientific inquiry is pervaded by the normative and by values, or do you think that it can be purely descriptive and it can at least ideally be stripped away from our social values and our social behavior? So if it is the case that science and inquiry are pervaded by values, and we know that the inquiries and the scientific realm are dominated by a particular group, a particular social group, what effect does that have on discourse? Is that a good or a bad situation for science as a whole? The standpoint theorist points out that it's a really bad situation for science as a whole, in the same way that it's bad for democracy if, control of the means of production is had by only a few people. You don't really have a genuine democracy in that situation because there's so much power in one part of society that it negates any little bit of power that's had in another part of society. So you might be able to think of inquiry the same way. But in this case, the inquiry might be harmed by its own bias, because now it'll turn out that it's not just something to care about for reasons of justice that marginalized or underprivileged groups do not participate in inquiry or the scientific method, but also because the dominant and oppressive group don't have the tools to do good science or good inquiry by themselves, because their values will sometimes misguide them and get them to ask the wrong questions and get them to look at the wrong data or make the wrong inferences from the data that they have, so on and so forth. So the standpoints theorist's opinion is generally that science is worse off if it doesn't have a more diverse representation among the inquirers themselves. And there's a question for you. Can you think of examples where the absence of diverse viewpoints in a scientific discipline has produced problematic good science, besides the Virginia Woolf example? And follow-up question, if you can think of an example like that, was that ever overturned? And was that situation overturned for a particular reason? What was the motivation for overturning that assessment of that state of affairs? How did the overturning occur? Was it because suddenly a marginalized group participated in fixing the discourse, or for some other reason? And now one important thing I want to say here is I think a really helpful example for us to discuss would be one that's not purely in social theory, because it's going to be obvious, right, that if you're studying people and you're leaving out an entire group of people in studying people, like in the Virginia Woolf case, that you're probably going to get some things wrong. But can you think of an example where you're not necessarily studying society, you're studying something else scientific, but leaving out a particular marginalized group actually harmed that discipline making progress sooner? And if you can think of that example, I would love to hear it, and I would love to discuss it with you in class. So to take a step back for a moment, what's another reason to buy standpoint theory if you're not a Marxist, or if you're not committed to I don't know, the general project of diversity and inquiry. Maybe you think, oh, well, that's a social good, but why is it an epistemic good? Why should I take this seriously as a theory of scientific methodology? Why should I think that norms and values pervade all of inquiry? Well, I think it's gonna be difficult in this lecture to cover everything having to do with the question of the normative and its relationship to the objective, to the pursuit of truth, and so on and so forth. But one thing that I'll say is that it does seem intuitive to say that what social relationships you've been in and what locations you've inhabited in social space change what you have knowledge of. Like in a trivial way, isn't it the case that all of us have different bits of knowledge depending on where we grew up, or who we went to school with? I mean, most of the things that I know about the world, I've learned about because of the kinds of people I tend to interact with, not because of some special skill or ability that I have that other people don't. There are certain things that it would be impossible for me to learn if it were not the case that I was interacting with people who could teach me about them or show me where to find the answers for certain things. And there's certain stories and experiences that I wouldn't know about if I hadn't known people who had those experiences. So in a sense, the more people you know from a wider group, the more, in a sense, you might have the capacity to understand on a human level. But it's also the case that trivially, right, and I'm just talking about a basic case, not one in which there's any specific marginalized features to the experience, but in a basic case, because who I know determines, you know, what I believe and what I think is a good inquiry and what I think is an interesting question, if you were to create a very homogeneous group to study anything, whether or not that homogeneous group was problematically and privileged, you know, like problematically homogeneous and privileged in a materially, socially important way, but if they were homogeneous, if they shared not only general features of their background, but also general features of their system of beliefs and general community participation, they all knew the same people, there'd be a limited set of things that they would productively be able to inquire into. And so it would be in your interest, if you were designing kind of an inquiry committee, to make it as diverse as possible, in the sense of diversity of minimally having a diversity of ideas and opinions. Because, you know, if everybody is always consensus about everything, you're not going to find the truth necessarily, because sometimes it takes a little bit of double checking to make sure that you've got things right. And if everybody agrees all the time, you're not going to get a double check. So you need at least some disagreement. But is mere disagreement enough? Is it enough to get like a person who is from the same background, has had relatively the same experiences, but is just a contrarian? Like, is that going to fix all of your epistemic problems? I'm not sure. The position of the standpoint theorist is that it might not be enough, because sometimes objecting to a view won't be enough to be able to fill in the information that you're missing to make other views sound more plausible, or to make clear why your inquiry is headed in the wrong direction, right? So you need not only to be able to dissent from an opinion, you also need to be able to bring in as wide a net in terms of evidence as you can. And flat-footedly, the most basic kind of standpoint theory just says that people who have a standpoint, who have an epistemically privileged standpoint on a particular question, have that evidence, and they've built up a kind of social expertise, and maybe a kind of more general expertise because of their social location that could be beneficial in inquiry. Now, there's lots of questions we can ask about that. How robust is this theory? Does it smell too feminist for some people? I mean, I don't think you can be too feminist, but that's just my view. But some people balk, and so that's something we need to talk about. And finally, does it make a difference what it is that we get knowledge about if we have accrued a standpoint? Like, does my standpoint give me privileged access to so many kinds of knowledge that I'm useful to any inquiry? Or is it domain specific? Those are some questions standpoint theorists haven't entirely answered. But maybe it'll be important then to talk about specific examples, cases where we think a standpoint theorist might have a point historically, in order to learn whether there are limits to this perspective. And then, of course, the overarching background question. Is it normativity all the way down? Is all of our science value laden? Because if you think that it is, then standpoint theory will be very pressing, because you'll be immediately attuned to how having a particular social position might change your values, and then it might be really, really important to make sure that you're modulating what values are represented among the inquiring group. But if you don't think its values all the way down, does that eliminate the appeal of standpoint theory? Is it a necessary condition of standpoint theory that it thinks that values are important to inquiry? What do you think? So I look forward to speaking with you in class. Take care, have a safe election night, and I hope you manage to get some sleep, and I hope you take care of yourselves. I'll see you again soon. Bye.